Everyone gather around, whoever wants to come to the presentation here. This is a fellow friend, Quaker, Conway, South Carolina. Professor Emeritus from Coastal Carolina University, Jim Henderson, who has an interesting perspective growing up as a young boy in Bogalusa, Louisiana, and lived under the Jim Crow laws, and very interesting perspective of what it was like to live there during the 1950s, and so how he became a Quaker. Thanks, Jim.
Before we begin, if someone wants to speak later on, if it's possible, just to pass the microphone around.
Yeah, well, hi. In terms of format, since this is a 2-hour workshop, I had thought it might be well for me to speak for 1 hour flat. And so, as a retired college prof, you know, I was always big on beginning when the class is supposed to begin and ending when it's supposed to begin. And then that would give us, now please interrupt me at any time. And you may hear a few things that aren't pleasant, but we're all adults here, almost all of us, I guess. Like that?
Yeah.
Okay, good. And so I would hope there would be some questions generated along the way. So again, either just, raise your hand, or then when we're done, if things occur to you, want more input on, well, we'll have a whole hour for that. And so this is how I think this should go, really. Well, good morning. It's great being up here, as you'll hear at the end in the little section, why I became a Quaker. Oops, let me get the time. Exactly 9:30. That's easy. If it's 10:30, 1 minute from, just do like that, and I'll know to wrap it up. I'll put a wrap on it. We'll be done by at 10:30. So the title of this is A Quaker Growing Up in the Jim Crow South, and there it is. Made a few corrections. I typed this up just before I headed up here yesterday, little outline. And Five Rivers Friends with a 5. If you're ever down around Myrtle Beach area, please come and worship with us. And we've got my son Joe, who's not here. We have one of my sons, Tom. He's around here somewhere. But Joe put together this website, so there it is. Now, this presentation is drawn from the first chapters of my memoir. Now, here's how the memoir ended up being written. About a year and a half ago, I was talking with a friend after worship down there at our meeting, and I was going on about this town where I grew up, Bogalusa, Louisiana, and I was telling some of these things that happened that I saw when I was growing up there. And I said, I've been trying to get somebody to write something about it. This is an important place in the history of the civil rights movement, on, and I can't get anybody to do it. And Keith, it's dedicated to Keith and a couple of other people, Burroughs was his name. He looked at me and he said, Jim, there's only one person who can write this. And then I knew I had to write it. So here it is. And the title, I think it's appropriate. It's all about race. This is, to me, I taught for many years, and I would tell my students, African American students especially, that this is the biggest issue in our country, the biggest problem. And so generally, my story personally has been, I've been concerned about race throughout my life from the second grade. So I'll tell you the story about how I became aware as a second grader that we have an issue with the race black, white, white, black in this country. So this is the memoir. And first, just a couple of questions. I sent a couple of copies of the memoir to Dietrich and to another friend here. I don't think they looked at it, but at any rate, maybe took a small peek. So let's start with a couple of questions before I get to the 4 chapters I'll touch on. And the fourth one is very quick. It has to do with when I became a Quaker, and that was summer of 1964. And so I've just passed 60 years as a friend. And I'm happy to say that. I still am. So first, 3 questions. Where is Bogalusa, Louisiana? Now, I want you to look with me at my imaginary visual of the state of Louisiana. So you got it? It's a big audio visual. And it's shaped like a boot. Yeah, it's shaped like a boot. And so has anyone here ever been to Bogalusa? No, of course not. It's not on any road. You never would go through it. And the only way you ever would go there is you're going there, you know. And by the way, I did that, my wife and I, for chapter 10 of this. Is very short. Bogalusa today, 2024. So I'm not going to touch on any of that, but if you're interested, you could read it. It's not, I say it's copyright, but there are copies here floating around, the 2. Photocopy it, whatever. Just read if you'd like. So no one has been there. Does anybody know where it is in this big boot-shaped state? This is important because the geography of what I'll be saying, I got plenty of time left, will be germane to where the place is located. So, anybody have an idea? Anybody know? Okay, so here's the boot, and a boot, here's the toe of the boot, comes down like that, and then the toe extends to the Gulf of Mexico. The end part of the boot, rather. And there is a river. I'm a retired college prof. You got to give me a break. You know, there is a river that forms the boundary between Louisiana to the west and the state just to the east. It's a river that flows down into the Gulf of Mexico. What's the name of the river? It's in the news every so often. It's called the Pearl River. And it flows roughly from Jackson. It floods every so often. And Bogalusa, so here's the river, here's the toe. The river flowing down here. Bogalusa is just at where your big toe would be in your boot, way up on the banks of the Pearl River in Louisiana. Well, a little bit more on that later. So anyhow, this is just background to help us get into this. So that's the question, where is Bogalusa, Louisiana? Second, this town was, during the era of racial segregation in this country, the most racially segregated of any town, not just in the South, in the whole United States. The most, my studied opinion, segregated. So why was this place the most segregated town. It's just a town. So it never got much more than 15,000. It's a town, you know. And today, after the Hurricane Katrina ravaged it, it's only 10,000 people. That didn't get in the news. Bogalusa gets no respect. My friends, I kept listening. Katrina passed right over Bogalusa. Well, actually, just a little bit to the east over a place called Poplarville. We'll come back to Poplarville, Mississippi, 21 miles away due east. And no one noticed. No one thought of Bogalusa. No one sent FEMA. I kept listening. The town's devastated. They had to declare martial law. All the trees were knocked down. No one could get out. Anyway, back to this. The question, why was Bogalusa the most segregated town in the nation from the time of its incorporation? Now listen to this date, 4th of July, 1915. 1915. Up until the black population of Bogalusa, this figures in chapter 5, that I'll not be touching on, rose up, took up arms. They were called the Deacons for the Defense. Some of you might be a little older, might remember that term, and demanded an end to segregation. Well, the question, though, was why was it so segregated? Here are the answers. A, given the fact that it was established a little bit into the 20th century, Jim Crow was well established throughout the United States. It really, you could look at the year 1870 for its beginning. And so when the town was created suddenly, I'm coming to that, it had to be segregated, right? It had to be segregated. So it was a new town. Second, its founders from upstate New York, timber barons, who founded Bogalusa, they were wealthy men. They came down and they bought tens and tens of thousands of virgin, mostly white and loblolly pine. I've been looking around here, this wonderful camp, and it could be some of the lumber that was produced from that pine you could find in these buildings here in this somewhat historic YMCA camp. These men had a unique possibility. Their names were names like Goodyear and Sullivan from upstate New York to create a town from scratch. So they hired a firm in New Orleans to draw a city map for Bogalusa. If you Google it, that map is actually there. You Google Bogalusa, and there's the old city map, and it specified where blacks and whites must, not should live, but must live. Once they started cutting in their huge mill, let me give you the name of that. It's called the Great Southern Lumber Company. And for 20 years or so or more, it was the largest sawmill in the world, cutting out all of that. No one had ever lived in that area before it, so it was just all these many pine trees, millions and millions. The Great Southern Lumber Company, in order to get its lumber to places like here and throughout, I think, most of the central part of the United States, had to build a railroad track. And the railroad track went roughly through the city north-south. And that's how they got their lumber out. Jackson, Mississippi was to the north. New Orleans, Louisiana was somewhat to the south, a little bit southwest. And once they had the railroad put in, the lumber flowed, and it flowed for many years out of this place. So knowing this, the city planner hired by these timber barons said, it's simple. Now, the sawmill, later the paper mill, today it's a paper mill town, will live and must live in neighborhoods to the east of the railroad track. Well, it's labor related, because the sawmill, later the paper mill, is to the east of the tracks. And all the white people lived to the west of the track. And that's the way it was. So I grew up in a town that was completely segregated by design. In this little section, I'll be ending with time I was 20, 21, maybe 22 years old. The first conversation I ever had with anyone who was African American in the town. That's how segregated it was. You didn't, if you were white, you didn't go in the black neighborhoods, vice versa. I mean, you could have some lady who was a housemaid or something like that. If you had some little job or something or other, you could travel to it and then go back home. Isn't this interesting? Bogalusa, who knew? Finally, in this section, preliminary, and then I'll go quickly through some of the highlights from these 3 chapters, ending in 1964. Now, that's a year to conjure with. Civil rights movement. What happened? Was it in summer of 1964? Huh? Well, I was similar, but it was the Freedom Summer in Mississippi, when good-thinking people in the North sent young people into Mississippi to register voters, to found freedom schools, and so forth. I didn't go over there. Here's a question. It's a little out of order from this talk. So here I am. I'm from Louisiana. I'm interested in matters, as it turned out, the civil rights movement. I ended up going to San Francisco to a big civil rights program that the American Friends Service Committee had a lot to do with. Back in '64, as this Freedom Summer program in Mississippi was going on, the Quakers thought it might not be so wise to send my child down to a place could be dangerous. So what they did is they organized in the Bay Area, and I'm coming to that, this is part of one of these chapters, and so that's where I became a Quaker. I certainly wouldn't have run into any in Mississippi, that's for sure. Okay, here's the last of these questions. Why is Bogalusa called the Magic City? It's called the Magic City because it sprang into existence so fast. These people came down, these wealthy men, they laid out this city. They started sawing this lumber, sending it all parts of the United States. And at one time, at its height, it was the most industrialized, most vigorous, active town in the entire state of Louisiana. The Magic City. Well, later, and it was something I don't have time to talk about, somebody came in and looked at what was going on there, and they gave it another nickname. Does anyone guess what that was back in '64? Clantown, USA. Yeah. Okay, now to the matter at hand. Chapter 1 of my memoir. It's real short, Dietrich, it's very short. Bogalusa in White, 1946 to 1956. 1954. Hey, 54, that's another civil rights date of interest, you know. I moved there the year after the World War II ended because my father was sent to Bogalusa to manage a creosoting plant there. So in January, just before I turned 5, I'm living in Bogalusa, Louisiana. And it was great. I mean, Dietrich once wrote me something in an email that, you know, the Klan this, and no, the Klan, nobody knew anything about that. It wasn't any problem. So I went to school. I started school, of course, in a white neighborhood called the North Side. And I went to the first grade at our wonderful old, built by the founders. It'll come back into the story soon. The high school was the primary school, and then there was it was a huge thing. It covered 2 blocks, built with this first growth pine. Well, then, after the war, money started being freed up, and I went to the second grade at a brand new elementary school just across from the old high school, and I had this fabulous teacher named Mrs. Williamson. And the thing that had, I know, a later impact on my life, she taught us a section of second grade, world geography. Well, the world included a mention of the Scandinavian countries and Holland. However, she taught us about the polders in Holland. And wonderful how they reclaimed land from the sea. And I've loved geography ever since, so those early grades are important, apparently. Well, one day, toward the latter part of the school year, we came into class and we had brand new textbooks. And oh man, you know, we played with, picked them up, we smelled them the way you do. You know, we have a new book. And after we did that, I raised my hand and I said, Mrs. Williamson, what happened to the old textbooks? And she said, well, we gave them to the colored children. You may not know up here in New Jersey, but throughout the South, the old textbooks were given to the African American public school students. And to make it even worse, they had a stamp on them called for colored use only. And I have a friend in Conway who I see a lot, and he's black, and he said it's like a blade cutting him, that stamp. In chapter 1, there's lots more in there, but this is all we have time for. Now we come to chapter 2 is titled Bogalusa in White and Black, 1954 to 1963. And it has a few sections. These are highlights, just highlights. The first is titled Bogalusa's Burning Season. Well, one day, when I was 15 years old, I was at our wonderful YMCA, built by the founders in the time of Teddy Roosevelt, you know, men doing manly things. And so it had an indoor swimming pool, and we all swam naked. No one thought anything about it, but I mean, it was just a wonderful high school, YMCA. And one day I was sitting with some friends in the lobby around a table, and a young black man came up, and to ask our opinion on something he had drawn. And what so he sat down with us and he showed us a hand-drawn, with pencil, a rooster. And he had found a contest in the back of a comic book, and it had the rooster in the comic book, and whoever could most closely, with freehand, draw this rooster would win the contest. And we looked at it. I'd never seen anything like it. It was perfect. It looked just like the one in the comic book. And we complimented him, said, oh yeah, you're sure you're going to win this contest. So we went back. He must have been given some little job in the Y. Keep in mind, he should not have been there, right? He shouldn't have been there. And apparently someone noticed this young black man talking with these young adolescent white boys. Next week, the YMCA burned to the ground. I've always thought, with no proof, keep in mind, these outrages were never talked about by adults that I knew, not my parents. We had a wonderful newspaper. They weren't reported in the newspaper. But I've thought someone saw something happening between blacks and whites that day and decided it wasn't going to happen again. So they burned the old original YMCA. About a year passes, maybe a little bit less, and mysteriously, our wonderful old high school, built with this pine wood, burned to the ground. I'm still very offended by this. I go by and look at what's there, there's next to nothing there now. No one said anything about it. There was no investigation. By this time, a new high school had been built on the ashes, sort of literally, on the ground where the YMCA was. And I was in the first class there. And so word had it, and up the previous year, we had gone to the old high school, junior high, that some of the Ku Klux Klan, with a can of gasoline, had broken in, gone up to the attic, splashed it around, throwing a match, and that was that. This was talk on the schoolyard. To this day, neither of those, I think, arsons has ever been investigated. Now, there's so much about this place that's important, and I end the memoir begging colleagues of mine who are academics to please study this place. There's so much there that merits so much more than just something like what I wrote. Now, let me give you a name. This is a lot of U.S. history, and I'll mention along the way, like now, things that names of people who people should know about. Has anyone here ever heard the name Mac Charles Parker? Well, Mac Charles Parker was a young black man who lived now across from the Pearl River, Mississippi, is called Pearl River County. They have counties in Mississippi like most other places, maybe not here. But in Louisiana we have parishes, so my parish is called Washington Parish. Remember, let's see if you've been paying attention. What was the town 21 miles east of Bogalusa across the river in Mississippi? Poplarville. Poplarville. All its trees got knocked down by Katrina also. At any rate, Mac Charles Parker raped a young white woman. Well, he was caught and he was put in the Poplarville jail and was awaiting trial on April 24th, 1959. I was a junior in high school that year, in Bogalusa High School. Well, this particular evening, a group of men, Klan no doubt, went to the jail of Poplarville and removed Mac Charles Parker with the intention of lynching him. So this name is important. And by the way, if any of this you'd like to check into, any of you would like to, Cambridge University Press in the 90s someone published a monograph on this whole incident that I'm telling you about. They drove to, guess where? Bogalusa. They drove over the Pearl River Bridge and pulled over and murdered Mac Charles Parker in Bogalusa, draping his body with logging chains and decapitating him. After doing that, they turned around, they went back over the bridge, stopped at the bridge, threw Parker's remains into the Pearl River, and drove back home. And of course, people could find out who this was. Nothing ever happened to him. That's lynching for you. But this was the last, and I use this term advisedly, classic lynching in the United States to my knowledge. I've contacted the people in Alabama who have that monument, to lynching victims in the United States. They said, no, we only come up to the 20th century. Well, why? Of course, because there are people alive who would get somewhat bent out of shape hearing that they participated in a lynching. Could be some violence coming out of that. So Parker deserves being remembered. Well, the city, there was all the talk of the high school, the town, the news, the newspapers, what had happened to Parker. The city officials went, and they didn't take them long. They got in boats, and they found the body of Parker in the river and retrieved it. The next day, a friend named Albert Walker came up to us and he said, "Did you hear that they found Mac Charles Parker's head? It was sitting on a stump singing, 'I ain't got no body.'" I didn't think it was funny. Now, to the end of this chapter that goes all the way up to when I was in my early 20s. And the day I had my first ever conversation with somebody about my age who was African American. I'm not counting that at the Y, some kid with the rooster drawing. So, the way it works in Bogalusa, the best jobs are in the paper mill. Today it's the paper mill. And I worked right after I graduated from high school, but after that, they knew I was a college kid, so no more work. So I didn't have very much work. So this day I had a short-term job loading, I couldn't get a job, and so I was working where a company was putting blasting sand in these big bags that you see here and there. And my job, and there was a crew of about 4 of us, and our job was to take these big old bags and stack them on pallets. So we would do that, and then finally we had a lunch break and would have some water. One of the crew of maybe 4 was this guy, black African American, about our age, you know, and that sand was so hot. The three white guys, we had gloves, work gloves, and we moved fast because the sand was dried in a big natural gas dryer, and then it was put in the bags. When they hit the conveyor belt, that was hot. And I looked at him one day at our lunch break. I said, why aren't you wearing gloves? And he said, well, I'm toughening up my hands for baseball. Congratulations to the Phillies, by the way. My team, the Cardinals. Maybe next year we'll make the playoffs for sure. At any rate, who knew a baseball team? They have a baseball team, probably pretty good in Bogalusa. And that's Dad. I didn't know. Well, you know why I didn't know. Segregated. Might have, you know. When we were losing football in Bogalusa High School, they were winning state championships to black high school. We didn't know anything about that either. Oh, and this is fun. Got to be some humor in this. It has some kind of grim things. So one day at our break, he said, you know what? I was talking with him. He said, north of Bogalusa, in this little village called Angie, he said, there is somebody, a friend of mine, who works at a shipping company loading and unloading trucks, you know, and you know how they back up to these loading docks. And he said, this guy he knows, young guy, could stand on the ground at the edge of the loading dock and leap vertically and end up standing on the loading dock. Must have been like a 4 or 5 foot vertical leap. And so years later, when the film was released, White Men Can't Jump, I just smiled. I'd known that for a long, long time. All right, here we come to chapter 3, College and the Civil Rights Movement, 1960 to 64. Well, in the early 60s, we were I couldn't get a job. You know, I was fired by my own father from this blasting sand thing right in the beginning of July, and so I would hitchhike. I had a master's degree in hitchhiking before I got a real academic master's degree, and so I went with a buddy up to Minnesota. We hitchhiked to the World's Fair. I saw an article in Esquire magazine called 9 Places to Hide. Now, we assumed there would be nuclear war. Remember the bomb shelters? You couldn't be thinking about that again. At any rate, so one of the places to hide was Mendoza, Argentina. And so I decided I would hitchhike from Bogalusa to Mendoza, Argentina. And I set off, I think I had $200 in traveler's checks, and headed south. And to my dismay, I discovered my planning had left out one fact about hitchhiking from here to Argentina, and that was by land. You can't do it, can you? There's this thing called the Darien Gap that's in the news all the time. Have you heard there's an election going on and immigration and all that and da-da-da? I didn't make it. I had to turn around and I hitchhiked back home. I'm not going into my travails of learning Spanish. I thought, oh, maybe this will help me. It took me 8 years to learn Spanish. It was awful. I got back, I didn't speak any more Spanish than when I had hitchhiked down through Central America. Well, it got to be 1963, and I'm a senior in college. And I'm from Louisiana. I went to college at the white Methodist College in Shreveport, where I was born. Centenary College, it's called. The blacks had their own college, of course, down in New Orleans in kind of a flood-prone area called Dillard College. And I said to myself, well, enough of this hitchhiking all around. I want to do something socially responsible. I thought, social work. I'll do some sort of social work. And so my girlfriend at the time agreed, well, that would be cool. We graduate from college and we do a summer internship doing social work. And we went all over there. We talked to faculty members who had worked as medical missionaries overseas. And the guy said, you do not do that. That's horrible. We went to the state social work office and they said, oh yeah, we've got social work programs for the summer, but you've got to sign up to be a professional social worker. I said, no, I'm going to be a college teacher. I don't want to be a social worker. And so the semester ended. We went home for Christmas break. Kind of discouraged, came back, so now it's 1964, January 1964. I'm riding around in the car with some friends, and I heard on the radio a report. Now, I'll ask you this, another question. Have you ever heard of this? The Cadillac showroom sit-ins in San Francisco, led by the NAACP. See, they would love to sell Cadillacs to black folk, but they wouldn't hire it. You couldn't get one, you couldn't go if you're black, have a black guy. Sell you one, da-da-da. No, you haven't heard of that. Well, the light bulb went off when I heard that, and I thought, the civil rights movement. I can work in the civil rights movement. By the way, this was when recruitment was going on for the Freedom Summer of 1964. I didn't know anything about it. How could that be? If I heard about it, I might have said, sure. I would have walked across the Pearl River Bridge into Mississippi, and there I would have been, but I hadn't heard of it. Any idea why? Well, no recruiter for Mississippi Freedom Summer in his right mind would have gone to Louisiana. He might not have gotten out of there with his life or her life. I knew nothing about it, but I knew something was going. Dr. King had the march the previous year, 63, March on White, et cetera, et cetera. But how do I find a way to do this? Well, I got hold of something about a group that was organizing rent boycotts in Harlem. And I thought, a Southern boy with a heavy accent organizing rent strikes in Harlem, I don't think so. That wouldn't compute. So there I was, and suddenly, now another name's going to come, and I hope you recognize it, and if not, I'll come back. This person is mentioned in a subsequent chapter. A lady, she's Right Ann Braden in Knoxville, Tennessee. Does that ring a bell anywhere? Ann Braden, ANNEBRADEN. I learned sometime later, that she published The Southern Patriot. And she, among all white women, was praised as the most beneficial to civil rights in the South by Eleanor Roosevelt and Martin Luther King Jr. That's who I wrote. And she sent me an address, and she said, yes, there is this program in San Francisco that's being organized. And they'll give you room and board, lasts all summer, and $5 a week for incidental expenses. And back then, you know, you could do some stuff with $5 a week. Well, I wrote the address, was accepted. And they said, show up, gave me a date in early June of 1964. And so I went back to Bogalusa and I packed my little hitchhiking gear and put my little sign, said San Francisco. And I set out, I said, I think it'll take me, I timed it so I'd be there in 3 days. I was good at hitchhiking. I could get where I wanted back in those days. There's something in here about how I went about hitchhiking, but I won't go into that. The afternoon of the 3rd day found me on Hugo Street in San Francisco, walking up the steps of a nice 2-story house just across from Golden Gate Park. And I knocked on the door and said, hi, I've been accepted for this program. The door opened, I went in. They inscribed me in the program. It didn't take me long to see Quaker influence in this program. The house was owned by the San Francisco Friends meeting. The P couple who were the house looking over 25 or so of these interns, such as myself, I think were Quakers. During that summer, we worshiped. We went to the Friends meeting in San Francisco and met with them. At one point in the summer, we went to this fabulous camp north of San Francisco called the John Woolman Camp. Now that rings a bell. Mount Holly, New Jersey, the greatest of all Quakers, in my humble. And every afternoon when we came back from work, and we were in all these groups, I happened to have been interned with the NAACP. A lot to that, but it's in the chapter 4, if you're interested in reading it. We sat, and in the manner of friends, all this group, we had a short few minutes of silence. And then we said, okay, I did this. Another one, oh, I went there. And I was hooked. I said, summer of 64, I'm a Quaker. 60 years ago plus a month. And I still am. Thank you. You just going to talk? Do I keep this? I'll just hand it to anybody. Okay. So, and I remind you that the last chapter, we went to Bogalusa, and it's a Democratic stronghold. African Americans have taken over. You got an African American mayor. On and on, there's been white flight. So who knew Clantown, USA would turn out to be a place like you have in New Jersey where Democrats could get elected. Doesn't happen in South Carolina very much. So that's it. Again, it's a lot more, but does anyone have any, and we'll pass the microphone if anybody has a comment or a question or anything.
Do you still talk to any of your white classmates or anything back in Bogalusa? Have they seen a change in their upbringing like you have?
Well, the second part is no. The first part is the answer is interesting. So, I grew up in the white community and, the white Methodist church and on and on. And when I started writing this memoir, I would write some of them and ask if they would like to see any of it or whatever. The white community doesn't want to think about those days. They don't.
Maybe I missed it, but what happened in school integration? What's the question again? What happened during the era of school integration?
Everybody who's in a situation like that, they say, that's a great question. I'm not going to say that. Important question. What happened is that, as described in four-part harmony in chapter 5, which is titled The Civil Rights Movement Comes to Bogalusa, the Civil Rights Act was passed in summer, while I was in San Francisco, summer of 1964, stating, you got to open everything up. This is no joke. Well, well-meaning whites in Bogalusa, and there were a lot of them. Now, the nexus between the Klan and the white population is you had doctors and lawyers and very articulate people who would tell the Klan what to do, up to murder, And, for example, when I was in San Francisco, a very thoughtfully composed Klan letter was thrown in my parents' driveway saying my sister's on the left too, and her brother is working on the NAACP in San Francisco. It had to be the black population. The whites tried, under the Civil Rights Act, there were monies for a little tasteful black-white interaction. And when somebody tried to do that at the end of 1964, the Klan just went ballistic, and there were threats and things all over the place. And so about that time, James Farmer, who was the sit-in, led the sit-in movement, and had been interested in Louisiana and was born just beyond, we were almost homeboys in Marshall, Texas, just beyond Shreveport, where I was born, decided to send 2 young field workers of CORE, it was the Congress of Racial Equality is what it was called, to Bogalusa to help the black community, which had been active for decades. I mean, they had worked and worked, but the time just wasn't right. And so as soon as they arrived in Bogalusa, and I'm not going to take time to answer this fully because it's answered fully in chapter 5 of this memoir, the police chief went to the home, private home, of a man named Robert Bob Hicks. And they were like that with the Klan. Remember, just a month before, I'm talking February 1 of 65, and that's why I made it a point when we went to find out about Bogalusa today, I was there it's a historic site with these big, these big plaques, these metal things, and going to lay a wreath the day that the Civil Rights Movement came to Bogalusa. And his daughter was very forthcoming. She's now one of the people I've dedicated this to, named Barbara Hicks. And what the sheriff and his deputy said, if you do not leave immediately from your home, right up there on the main street of Bogalusa, there's a mob of people who are going to come and kill every one of you and burn your house. Well, there had been organized just a month earlier in another little Louisiana paper mill town something called the Deacons for the Defense. They armed themselves. And as this conversation, and the sheriff had gone in while they were having dinner, the two core workers, the whole Hicks family, there were 5 kids, and the mother and the father, and Barbara Hicks sneaked off and started making phone calls saying, bring a weapon, come to my house. Well, this is when it started, and I'm stopping here. The deputy left. And by the way, I had the honor to meet Mrs. Hicks's mother, who was 93, not long before she died, it seems. And what he saw, even including standing on top of the one-story Hicks house, were all these black men carrying shotguns, hunting rifles, a lot of them. So the sheriff withdrew, nothing ever happened. That was the day the civil rights movement came to the town where I grew up. Yeah, no, it's historic. Somebody's got to write more about this town. Barbara, the daughter who called these people, published a little flyer that was useful to me. I'll just tell you 2 things that they're in that last chapter, but it's titled Bogalusa Matters. So historic in so many ways, and something I learned right at the end of this time, and I rushed to get this done before your tri-quarter so I could come with the whole thing. You know about the labor group called the IWW? The Wobblies. They were this radical, one big union group. They went to Bogalusa in the early 20th century to try to organize the black and white workers together in one big union. And the paper mill, it's still the Great Southern Lumber Company, had their own little police force. And what occurred in the year, forgot to verify it, I think 1929, you had the Red Summer after World War I. There was something called the Bogalusa Massacre, in which the lumber yard people just basically murdered the union organizers, especially the white ones. Any other? Oh.
You said you were raised Methodist in Louisiana. I'm curious what if racial issues or segregation was ever brought up in your church as a kid growing up. If it was ever addressed, or it was just ignored altogether as just a fact of life, or how was that dealt with?
Well, it wasn't. Thank you for the question. It wasn't dealt with at all because to use this saying, it's a good saying, all is horrible. It was what it was. You just didn't do anything with black people and vice versa. They had their Methodist churches and all. I guess there's so many questions because I couldn't go in there. The black high school, they had these wonderful football teams. And we kids hung out on, it was called Long Avenue, and the school was on the other side. They had put up a chain link fence, you couldn't see through it. We couldn't even see this black high school where they had baseball teams.
I want to bring things up to the 21st century, 2005. You said that when Katrina came through, things were hit in Bogalusa. I know I went down to the other side of the Pearl River, it was in Pass Christian, which I guess was in the Mississippi
Wiped
side.
out also. Yeah.
Very wiped out. And I'm trying to remember what I saw of African Americans. Their Pass Christian was invaded by Methodists, Episcopalians, Mennonites, Red Cross, FEMA. It had services all over the place. It needed them. I mean, most of their schools were destroyed and all sorts of stuff was going on. But that was an hour from Bogalusa. He said nothing came to Bogalusa. I think Pass Christian had plenty of white folk pleading for help.
Well, I misspoke to a certain extent. What I meant to say, we had a president called George W. Bush, and he had a FEMA head, good work, something or other. They never paid us any mind. However, private groups did all around the country. As far west as Arizona, volunteer groups came in, prominent among them Baptists, but from all over, from South Carolina, and they came in and did volunteer work. So we did have help, and they eventually cut with chainsaws their way out of the town. You couldn't get out, you couldn't get in. It was awful. I wasn't there at the time. I was living where I live now.
So, in the fall of 1963, I was going into my senior year of college, and I had heard that there was an African-American basketball star from our college, basically university, who had been doing voter registration in Georgia, and he was jailed in Americus, Georgia. And I got extremely upset about that, and I was afraid that they might drag him out. I mean, here's somebody from New Jersey, he's an African-American guy, drag him out and lynch him. But then I thought, that was probably not likely, it's just that I was so upset. And I'm sure you can't exactly answer this, but you think it might have happened because of Parker, I think his name was.
Matt Charles Parker?
Yes.
Well, Parker had apparently committed a capital crime, and had he gone to trial, he would have been given the death sentence, no doubt. I mean, no, thinking about those times. This young man, from New Jersey, would not have been like their number one person in the jail and all, but he had just been caught up in the system, and I imagine if you followed his story up, he got home relatively. Somebody bailed him out or something.
How close was Bogalusa to Philadelphia, Mississippi?
Say that again?
How close was Bogalusa to Philadelphia, Mississippi?
Bogalusa? Yeah, Bogalusa was south of Philadelphia, Mississippi, which is in North Mississippi, and Bogalusa is across from southern Mississippi. So I guess maybe 200 miles.
Did anything that happened in the previous summer in Mississippi affect Bogalusa at all?
Now that's a good question. No, it's like nothing was going on. Nothing was going on until the Civil Rights Act was passed, and the black population of Bogalusa in early '65 took things into their own hand. That caught people's attention. That's the only time Bogalusa was ever in the national headlines. But here's how the white population viewed it. I was out in graduate school out in Arizona, and I would call home and say, I'm reading these articles, and all this stuff's happening in Bogalusa. You know what my parents said? Nothing's happening here. That's just blown out of proportion. Well, we lived in a white neighborhood. They didn't see anything going on. They didn't see the police chief going to the Hicks home in a black neighborhood.
Hi, I'm Barnett. My dad was Southern Methodist from Louisiana. He was born in New Orleans, and he was a Navy person who went all over the place, and I landed in New Jersey at 5 years old. And then he died about 7 years later, so by the time I was a teenager, he was gone, and it wasn't very good. What I remember of his racism was a systemic kind of racism. There wasn't anything personal animosity against black people. He would always talk, and my mom would say it too, I'd rather live next to a good black person than a bad white person. And that was the message that I got when I was growing up. What I remember is that he hated Martin Luther King. He was a McCarthyite and John Birch Society person. So he was really anti-communist, and he thought Martin Luther King's just a communist plot, you know. So that was the systemic portion that I saw. And occasionally there'd be jokes where the point of the joke was making fun of black dialect or something like that. So that was the extent of racism, overt racism, that I grew up with in that household. As I said, he died when I was pretty young. So I didn't have any sustained interaction with him on that. But my brother went to college in '68 in Port Charleston, South Carolina. And I guess I was only about 11 or 12 when that happened. And a couple years later, he came back from college, and I was, I guess, a little bit worn out, middle teens, or early teens. I was kind of aware of the North-South civil rights issues. I was becoming more aware of that as I was growing up. And I asked him, well, what's it like in Charleston, South Carolina? And he said, well, it's not, everything's pretty peaceful. They stay in their place. Hearing that from my brother sort of knocked me on my butt. No one in my family talked that way. But he goes down to South Carolina, he's there for a year, and he says he sounds like he's lived there all his life. So that cultural immersion that he had was enough to make him situationally racist. Where we were in New Jersey, we didn't really have that kind of thing. So that's my observation growing up. And the Southern Methodists and the Northern Methodists split over slavery. So that's why when we talk about Methodists, it's two different worlds. The Southern Methodists.
Thank you. My wife, who claims the Philadelphia area and the Gloucester City across Asbury Park as where she's from, is so sick of me talking about Bogalusa, you know. But I've been blessed. I was blessed. My parents did not say things like that. My dad was from Minnesota, and he had to, living most of his life in Bogalusa, adapt to the place, but he never said any racist things, and maybe that's why. Now my brother is more like the relative you mentioned, pretty right wing, but my sister and I escaped that, and so luckily, Dr. King, for example, when we had our first son, now Tom, you're the third or the second or third son. Born in Bogota, adopted. At any rate, we named him James King Henderson. I called home and my mother said, King, where'd that come from? Dr. King.
Actually, I had kind of two questions, if you'll forgive me. And the first one's not quite a question. Well, it was just kind of a statement that I was wondering if you'd comment on. there's a study I read somewhere, I think it was a study, where when a social issue reaches 25% of like public consciousness, that's when it really starts picking up momentum and will actually start, like people will start protesting it and people will actually become aware of it, and eventually the social change will happen or anything. So kind of speaking to that, like people just weren't aware of it or anything like that. Do you think it kind of reached that point, or is it kind of a different situation there?
In Bogalusa.
Yeah, in your life and everything, kind of.
No, not really. The black population was always, maybe not today, but about a third of the population of the town. And they were talking to themselves. They were well organized. They couldn't have done what they did by arming themselves had they not been, but you didn't have white people getting on the bandwagon, so to speak.
Okay. The other thing, or I'll just, yeah. The other thing was, I was just curious, what's your meeting like today? Because I forget where your meeting is right now.
Conway, South Carolina.
Yeah. How is that today and whatnot?
Well, it's small, and I can speak to its smallness in terms of the history of the Religious Society of Friends. There have been schisms. And we had a little kerfuffle in our meeting just as the pandemic was breaking out, and we'd always been small. We just had 3 members, and now we're down to 2. I'll just put it that way. And the dissidents, they went out in the country where their leader went, and they have a meeting called, and please, if you're down, meet with them. It's called ORI. It's a silent H, H-O-R-R-Y, ORI Friends Meeting. Ours is 5 Rivers, and we're right in the middle of town. Okay, thank you. We're over time.
One
right.
more question.
All right.
Just a really quick comment. I was living in North Carolina when our Supreme Court was busy decimating the Voting Rights Act, and the statement was racism. They don't need Voting Rights Act anymore because there's no more racism.
Oh, nothing more than be said. Those rascals. Thank you all.
Thank you.